There is a shaft on the Giza Plateau that drops straight down into the rock, past 3 levels of cut stone, and ends in a room no one has ever been able to keep dry. At the bottom of it, close to 100 feet beneath the desert, sits a stone coffin the size of a small car, carved from a single block, its heavy lid shoved aside. It rests on a small island of bedrock, and all around that island is black water. Not a puddle, not a little seepage, a flooded chamber that has swallowed the deepest part of the structure and refuses to give it back. People have tried to pump it out for the better part of a century. The moment the pumps stop, the water climbs back up the walls and takes the room again. That is the first thing you have to understand about the ground beneath the pyramids. When you dig down here, you do not hit treasure. You hit water. And the water is winning. Now, here is the part almost no tour guide will tell you. That flooded shaft is not an accident. It is not the builders making a mistake and drowning their own tomb. The people who cut it went down to that water on purpose. They carved a chamber for a god, and they set it in the middle of an underground lake, at the exact depth where the earth turns wet. They knew the water was down there. They wanted the room to sit inside it. And that single fact splits the whole story wide open, because if the builders of Giza deliberately dug down to the water table 4,500 years ago, then the ground under these monuments was never just fill and bedrock. It was a destination, something they were trying to reach. Today, we are going to go through exactly why modern engineers say it is close to impossible to excavate beneath the Giza Plateau, what the oldest surviving texts claimed was hidden down there long before any machine could check, and what the newest scanning technology believes it is now seeing in the rock below the pyramids. Some of what we cover is confirmed and undisputed. Some of it is argued over by serious people. And one part of it, the largest part, no living human being has been allowed to reach. Stay with me, because the deeper we go under this plateau, the stranger the ground gets, and the harder it becomes to explain what these people were actually building down there. Most visitors never learn that shaft exists. They stand in front of the 3 Great Pyramids. They photograph the lion carved out of the bedrock. They buy a bottle of water, and they leave. Almost none of them walk the stone causeway that runs across the plateau. And even if they did, they would see nothing, because the entrance to the flooded shaft opens in the floor of that causeway, hidden beneath a slab, dropping straight down into the dark. Millions of people pass within a short walk of it every year. Most people walk right past it and never know it is under their feet. The Egyptians had a name for this place. They called it Rosttow. The word means something close to the passages below, the openings of the underground. And they did not use it only for this shaft. They used it for the whole plateau. In the old religious texts, Giza is called the house of the Lord of Rosttow, the domain of the god who ruled the world beneath the ground. For a long time, scholars read that the way you would read a poem on a headstone, a pious flourish, the sort of thing a priest says about any cemetery. For decades, they dismissed it as symbolic. Then people went down the shaft, and it started to look like the priests had not been writing poetry. They had been writing a location. The first modern record of the shaft comes from the 1930s. An Egyptian archaeologist named Selim Hassan, clearing the causeway, found a vertical cut through the rock, dropping into a chamber, and from that chamber, another shaft dropping deeper, and from that one, a third. 3 stacked levels going down almost 100 feet into the plateau. He got part way. The lower he went, the more water he met, until the bottom simply vanished beneath it. He tried to pump it out. The pumps lost. He recorded what he could reach and left the rest to the water, and it stayed that way for the next 60 years. In that time, local families used the flooded shaft as a swimming hole, lowering themselves into a tomb older than most of recorded history to cool off in the heat, most of them with no idea what they were floating in. It was not fully cleared until 1999, when a team led by the archaeologist Zahi Hawass went back down with heavier equipment. They pumped for 2 months straight. Hawass later called it the most difficult excavation he had ever worked on, describing the mud, the dust, the constant noise of running water, the feeling that the shaft did not want to be emptied. And when they finally reached the bottom, this is what the light found: a rectangular chamber, in the middle of it, a raised platform of rock, an island. On the island, a massive stone sarcophagus, its lid pushed to one side, and surrounding all of it, the groundwater. So still and clear in places that you can see the outlines of side rooms, disappearing beneath the surface. There is one more detail that stays with you. Cut into one wall of the shaft is a narrow tunnel running about 6 meters back into the rock, and it leads nowhere. It simply stops. To date, the deepest level, the team even lowered a boy on a rope down into the water to gather fragments from the flooded floor. They were working blind, in the dark, in a room that fills itself back up. Whoever made this went to enormous effort to reach a place they knew would drown, and then cut a dead-end passage into the wall of it, as if reaching for something in the rock that was never finished or never found. The level above it was just as strange. 6 rooms cut into the rock, holding 2 enormous granite sarcophagi, along with pottery and human bones. The datable material placed that level in the later period of Egyptian history, roughly 2,500 years ago, which creates its own small problem, because the deepest level, the flooded one with the island, appears in some readings to be far older than the room sitting on top of it. You dig a shaft from the top down, not from the bottom up, and yet the bottom seems to reach back further than the middle. Nobody has a clean answer for that. Now stand back and look at what this room actually is. A tomb built for a god, set on an island, ringed by dark water, sunk to the precise depth where the plateau floods. And then remember who that god was. In the old story, he was the ruler of the dead, a king who was murdered by his own brother, sealed inside a coffin, and cast into the water. His wife, a goddess of magic, recovered him, and he became lord of the underworld, enthroned forever in a watery realm beneath the world of the living. For centuries, people treated that as one of the great myths of the ancient imagination. Then, archaeologists climbed down a hidden shaft at Giza and found a coffin on an island, surrounded by water, built to look exactly like the story. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a room constructed to match the legend, sunk to the one depth where the earth itself provides the flood. This is where it gets stranger, because the Egyptians were not the only ones describing it. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt more than 2,000 years ago, and he wrote that beneath the Great Pyramid lay hidden chambers on an island, surrounded by water carried in through a channel, and that a king was buried there. For generations, historians treated that passage as a traveler's tall tale. One of the many things Herodotus got wrong, he described an island tomb ringed by water beneath the pyramids of Giza. And a hidden shaft on that same plateau ends in an island tomb ringed by water. He may not have been guessing, he may have been repeating what the priests of his day already knew was down there. So the shaft is real, the water is real, and the ancient description of it is real, which leaves the question that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine mystery. Where is all that water coming from? And why has no one in 100 years of trying been able to drain the ground beneath the pyramids and simply look? That is the second thread. And it is the reason engineers use the word impossible. Because before we get to what may be hidden down there, we hear the things standing in the way of ever reaching it. And it is not a curse, and it is not a conspiracy. It is a rising sea nobody can see. The Giza Plateau is not solid stone. It is limestone, and limestone is soft, porous rock, threaded with natural cracks and fissures, and in places, hollow caves carved out by water over unimaginable spans of time. This is ordinary geology. What is not ordinary is how close the water sits to the surface here. In parts of the plateau, The water table is only about 20 to 30 meters down. Below that line, the rock is saturated. Anything the ancient builders cut beneath it, any chamber, any passage, any shaft, is now underwater, and has been for a very long time. And the water has been climbing. Over the last several decades, the ground beneath Giza has grown wetter, not drier. The reasons are painfully modern. The city of Cairo has swelled right up to the edge of the plateau. Villages and new suburbs press against the ancient site. Irrigation canals soak the surrounding fields. Leaking pipes and drainage from the neighborhoods seep down into the rock. All of it feeds the shallow water table beneath the monuments and pushes it higher. It rose so far that standing water began appearing on the surface near the paws of the lion and around the ruined temple in front of it. The most famous monuments on Earth were beginning to sit in a slowly rising pool. That is not a fringe claim. It became an international emergency. Egypt's Antiquities Authority, working with foreign engineers and funding, launched a project with a name that tells you everything: the Pyramids Plateau Groundwater Lowering Project. Their solution was to drill a ring of 18 deep wells around the site and install industrial submersible pumps, the kind used to keep mines and construction pits from flooding. Those pumps run around the clock, pulling tens of thousands of cubic meters of water out of the ground every single day, drawing it down from as deep as 100 meters beneath the Sphinx, and dumping it away from the plateau. That is the quiet truth underneath the tourist photographs. The Sphinx and the pyramids are being kept dry by machines. Turn the pumps off, and the water comes back. Sit with that, because it reframes the entire question of digging here. You cannot simply sink a shaft under the Great Pyramid and go looking for chambers. The instant you break below that waterline, your hole fills. The soft limestone erodes when it is wet, so pumping too hard risks hollowing out the very rock the monuments are standing on, which is exactly what conservationists fear: a single inch. The plateau is not guarding its secrets with a trap. It is guarding them with hydrology. And here is the detail that should stop you. There are reports, going back centuries, of natural caves running under this plateau. In the early 1800s, a British diplomat and an Italian explorer working at Giza described crawling into catacombs and passages cut into the northern cliff, then lost track of them, and their accounts faded into footnotes. For nearly 200 years, no one relocated the entrance. In 2008, a British researcher went back to that same stretch of the plateau, near a spot known as the Tomb of the Birds, squeezed through a low opening behind a forgotten burial, and reported a system of natural chambers running back into the rock for a considerable distance, on a scale nobody had ever mapped. He described crawling deep enough that turning around became difficult, with the passages branching as they went. When satellite radar, built to read the ground, was pointed at the plateau, faint shadow lines appeared in the images. Long, curving features with no matching surface feature above them, seeming to run from those caves toward the second pyramid and then vanishing beneath it. Natural caverns, or fault lines that trace the path of caverns, threading through the bedrock directly under the monuments. If those passages exist and connect, then the ground under Giza is not a solid block at all. It is hollow in ways no one has fully charted. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you awake, subscribe now, because the next thing modern instruments found under this plateau is far harder to wave away. So we have a flooded shaft the ancients built on purpose, a rising water table nobody can permanently defeat, and reports of natural caves running under the pyramids like veins. For most of the last century, that was the limit of what anyone could say, because there was no way to see into wet buried rock without digging into it. And digging into it was the one thing the water and the weight would not allow. Then, modern science found ways to look without a shovel. You may have heard that physicists mapped hidden spaces inside the Great Pyramid using cosmic particles, tiny things called muons that rain down from the sky and pass through stone. That technique is real, and it is remarkable. But notice what it does. It reads the pyramid by catching particles that have traveled down through the structure from above. It is built to see up through the stone that sits over your detector. It is close to useless for the opposite problem, for peering down into saturated bedrock beneath your feet. To look below the plateau, investigators needed different tools. And when they finally aimed those tools at the ground under Giza, the readings did not come back empty. Start with the Sphinx, because the ground under it has been probed for longer than anywhere else. As far back as the early 1970s, teams from Egyptian universities and a major American research institute ran the first serious surveys, firing radar and electric current into the bedrock around the monument. In 1977, the American National Science Foundation funded another round, adding resistivity readings, magnetic mapping, and heat imaging. Part of what drove all that effort was an old and stubborn legend, the story that somewhere beneath or beside the Sphinx lies a sealed hall of records, a chamber of lost knowledge left by an earlier age. No serious archaeologist believes the legend is told, but the surveys it inspired were real, and in the following decades, those surveys kept coming, and they kept finding the same troubling thing. The rock beneath the Sphinx is not solid. In 1991, a geologist and a geophysicist studying the enclosure reported cavities beneath the paws and along the body of the statue, spaces that looked, in their words, too regular, too neatly shaped, to be simple, natural cracks. A few years later, another team brought in ground-penetrating radar and reported something even harder to ignore. A rectangular space beneath the left paw of the Sphinx, roughly 25 feet down, with clean dimensions about 12 meters by 9. A separate survey by Japanese researchers picked up grooves and hollows that seemed to run underneath the statue and connect, hinting at a tunnel passing beneath it from one side to the other. For decades, scholars filed all of this under natural fissures and old erosion, and some of it surely is exactly that. But here is the pattern that will not go away. Every time the technology improves, the anomalies do not shrink. They sharpen. The shapes get more geometric, more like corners and walls and floors, and less like random voids in limestone. When one early team drilled small test holes near the flank of the Sphinx to check the readings, they pulled up loose rubble and stone, but the drill stopped short of the main cavity the radar had drawn. They found the edge of something and did not reach its center. And then, as has happened again and again at Giza, the deeper work slowed, the access tightened, and the priority quietly shifted from finding out what the space was to making sure nobody disturbed it. Now, move away from the Sphinx, out to the flat field of tombs west of the Great Pyramid, and you reach the discovery that put this whole subject back into the headlines. Between 2021 and 2023, a team of Japanese and Egyptian scientists surveyed a strangely empty patch of that cemetery, a blank rectangle of ground with no monuments on it. Surrounded by tombs on every side, they used ground-penetrating radar and a second method that maps how easily electric current passes through the earth. And in that empty patch, where the surface showed nothing at all, the instruments drew a shape. An L-shaped structure, about 10 by 15 meters across, sitting only a couple of meters down and clearly filled in, backfilled with sand and gravel, as if someone had deliberately sealed it. And directly beneath it, deeper in the rock, a second, larger anomaly. The lead scientist said something that most experts are very careful never to say. He pointed out that a sharp, right-angled L shape is not something natural geology produces. Natural voids are ragged. This had corners. His team's careful conclusion, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2024, was that the readings could point to walls of cut limestone, or to shafts leading down to a tomb structure that no one has ever entered, in a spot everyone assumed was empty, a short walk from the Great Pyramid. It was found it was measured, and then it was left in the ground unexcavated. Because at Giza, that is what happens to the things below the surface. You are allowed to detect them. You are rarely allowed to open them. Which brings us to the claim that lit the internet on fire, and the reason this video exists. In March of 2025, a group of Italian researchers announced results from what they called the Khafre project. This was not their first attempt. Years earlier, in 2022, two of the same researchers had published a paper in a scientific journal claiming their radar method could reconstruct hidden internal detail of the Great Pyramid itself from satellite data. That earlier work laid out the technique. The 2025 announcement turned it on the ground beneath the plateau, using satellite radar data and a specialized processing technique, a method that reads tiny vibrations in the ground to reconstruct what lies beneath. They said they had mapped the rock under the Second Great Pyramid, and what they described was not a chamber, it was not a tunnel, it was a complex. According to their announcement, the data showed 8 massive vertical structures, like enormous wells or shafts, plunging more than 600 meters straight down beneath the pyramid. Around them, they described stacked chamber structures near the base, geometric passageways, and a network of tunnels running for as much as 2 kilometers, possibly linking all 3 pyramids together beneath the plateau. In their own words, the pyramids were only the tip of the iceberg, and the real structure was underground. 600 meters is not a tomb. That is deeper than most skyscrapers are tall, driven straight down into the bedrock, 8 times over. If it were confirmed, it would be the largest hidden structure ever attributed to the ancient world, sitting directly beneath the most photographed monuments on the planet. And it would mean that everything we say about why the pyramids were built is missing its foundation, literally. And it connects, uncomfortably, to that flooded shaft we started with, and those caves, and those cavities under the Sphinx, and that sealed L shape in the empty field. Every independent probe of this ground, using completely different tools in different decades, keeps returning the same verdict. There is more below Giza than anyone has been permitted to reach. Now, here is where the story develops the texture of every great buried mystery. The access has always been controlled. The plateau is one of the most heavily secured archaeological sites on Earth, ringed by fences and sensors, and permission to sink so much as an exploratory hole is guarded fiercely. Findings that hint at hidden chambers have a long habit, going back to the 1970s, of being acknowledged and then quietly downplayed. Surveys get run, anomalies get logged. And then the deeper investigation stalls. The reports gather dust, and the ground stays sealed. Whether the reason is the fragility of the monuments, the politics of who gets credit, or simple caution, the pattern is the same. The instruments say, "Look here." The gates stay shut. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That there is a vast underground city beneath Giza, a lost machine, the work of some forgotten super civilization hidden under the sand? Probably not, and the truth deserves better than hype. That 600-meter radar claim is heavily disputed, and the objections are serious. The researchers behind it are not Egyptologists, and their most dramatic conclusions have not been published and reviewed the way an extraordinary finding needs to be. And the deepest problem is physical. The former head of Egypt's antiquities, Zahi Hawass, the same man who cleared the flooded shaft, dismissed the underground city claim outright as baseless. A specialist in ancient Egyptian architecture at France's National Research Center, Jean-Guillaume Aulet-Peltier, pointed out the core issue with the technique. Satellite radar of that kind simply cannot resolve solid structures thousands of feet down through rock. The physics does not stretch that far. The 8 giant wells may be an artifact of how the data was processed, a pattern the software drew that the ground does not actually contain. On the wildest version of the story, the skeptics are almost certainly right. But strip away that one contested claim, throw out the underground city entirely, and look at what is left standing. because what is left is arguably stranger than the fantasy. There is a real shaft, cleared and photographed, that drops 100 feet to a stone coffin on an island in black water that has never once been permanently drained. There is a real water table, rising and measured, that forces 18 pumps to run day and night just to keep the Sphinx from standing in a pond. There are real cavities beneath that Sphinx, detected by university teams with legitimate radar across 5 decades, still unexplored and unexplained. There is a real, peer-reviewed, right-angled anomaly in an empty field beside the Great Pyramid, sealed with sand and never opened. You do not need a lost civilization to be unsettled by that. You only need to look at what is already confirmed and notice that every last piece of it sits beneath a monument no one is allowed to dig under. Below a waterline no one can hold back. The mystery here does not come from making things up. It comes from refusing to look away from the parts that are already true. And if even the modest version is true, it means something uncomfortable about the story we tell ourselves. It means that under the most studied ground on the entire planet, ground that has been measured and mapped and written about for 200 years, there are confirmed empty spaces that no human has entered, held shut, not by mystery, but by water and permission. It means our map of Giza stops at the waterline, and below that line is a blank we have chosen, or been forced, to leave blank. And if the ground under the most famous monuments on Earth still hides chambers we have detected but never reached, what does that say about all the ancient sites we have barely scanned at all? Here is the one question that will not let go. The builders of Giza cut a tomb and set it on an island in the flooded dark, on purpose, at the exact depth where the earth turns to water. They reached the water table deliberately, and then they built into it. So what were they trying to reach, or trying to seal, down there in the wet rock where no one could easily follow? We can detect the shapes, we can draw the outlines, we can pump for 2 months and stand for an hour at the bottom before the water reclaims it. But we cannot yet answer the only question that matters, which is what, if anything, is actually down there below the flood in the spaces the instruments keep finding and no shovel is allowed to open. The Great Pyramid is still standing on its plateau, exactly where it has stood since before the first word of history was written. The pumps are still running, drawing the water down, hour after hour, so the monuments above do not sink into the ground that holds them up. And somewhere beneath all of it, past the waterline, in the dark rock, the machines keep pushing back. There is a stone coffin on a small island, ringed by black water that has never fully receded, sitting exactly where they left it, 4,500 years ago. It was built to reach the water. It was built to sit inside it. And whatever the builders were reaching for down there, it is still below the flood, still sealed, still waiting for someone with the permission and the courage to finally drain the dark. And look,